Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Phenomenology of Spirituality. And it turns out that one of the things that happens when you have to learn a new language on a day-to-day level, as I'm learning French, is you become increasingly aware that how we use language and the ways we use it are, language is problematic, let's put it that way. Hence my previous recording episode on economics and what do we mean when we say economics and how is that influenced by our belief systems. One of the things I kept mentioning is that it's subjective, economics is, rather than objective. And this got me thinking that perhaps the most subjective experience that people try to express is that of spirituality. And is there a phenomenology of spirituality that would help us understand what it is people are trying to communicate when they talk about quote-unquote spiritual experiences? And how does that help us understand both how humans experience the world, but also questions of things like how do we experience anything, how do we try to communicate anything, and in what ways might our cultural understandings influence all of this? So spirituality I'll move on to in a second, but just to start with phenomenology. Now, the concepts that phenomenology explores have been around for a long time, but generally people point to Edmund Husserl as the sort of founder of phenomenology, or the person who just really tried to systematize this. And what phenomenology tries to do is it tries to explain sense experience or understand sense experiences, perceptions, thoughts, emotions from the view of the person. And rather than focusing on some external reality and how the subject relates to external objects, it really focuses on what are the perceptual apparatus, how do we experience it internally, what are the thoughts that go and emotions that go along with this, what senses are involved. So it's sort of an inside-out view of the human experience. And it makes no claims. This is one of the important things about, well, not no claims, but it really is not concerned with actual external reality per se. Now, there might be an external reality, but let's not be hasty. We don't need that. We're just going to roll along and assume that there might be something out there, but we're really much more concerned with how things are experienced and perceived. Of course, this work is carried on, I would say, interestingly, but perhaps unhelpfully, by Martin Heidegger. And but if you're interested in phenomenology as a general sort of field of philosophical inquiry, I would recommend Maurice Merleau-Ponty. I think he's more accessible, and his focus is less on questions of ontology and existence, which was, of course, time and being from Martin Heidegger. That was definitely his focus, and more on body and perception and space, these sorts of issues. So I think that could be somebody to look at. So phenomenology is an attempt to understand how humans experience the world and sort of study that systematically, unlike how it's normally been either just assumed. And again, I keep mentioning Kant. I'll keep mentioning Kant because, he really, I think, got this going, because he did point out that, wow, we're just limited by our perceptual apparatus. It doesn't matter what's in the world. If we can't experience it or see it or sense it or feel it, to us, it just doesn't really exist in some ways. And so he was the early articulator of that sort of limit on human capacity. And so in some ways you can see phenomenology as simply exploring those sorts of concepts in depth. So again, a shout out to Immanuel Kant. So as far as I can tell, doing, not a vast amount, but a fair amount of research on the word spirituality, is some concept very akin or close to spirituality, and spiritual quote-unquote practices exist all over the world from a vast range of times, and they have vocabulary that you go, okay, yeah, that looks like a pretty clear translation. Sometimes there are concepts or experiences or social forms that are difficult to translate from a culture from one time for another, across civilizations, across these cultural barriers and linguistic barriers. However, spirituality or spiritual doesn't seem to be. And so this raises question number one, I would say, is, are we using the word spiritual in our attempts to discuss the spiritual? Are we talking about a common human experience, right? It doesn't matter like a transcultural, it's sort of basic human experience that everyone or people in every society have had. And so it's articulated in the language that's developed in every society, or most every society, to try and express this. And therefore, it means that it's really innate to being a human being. That in some ways, perhaps you aren't really human if you had no experience or no sensibility or no sensitivity to this kind of thing. Or at least it's so common that it seems to occur in pretty much every society that we have good records for. Now, there may be exceptions. I just haven't been able to find one so far. So this is suggestive that whatever it is that people are trying to express when they say spiritual or spirit or these kinds of words is, it may be pretty innate to the human being, to the human experience, but that doesn't really help us again in saying what that is. And this, of course, immediately raises the question, or at least one of the questions it raises, is if it is universal, is this explain where religion comes from? Religion also very popular and in its many, many diverse guises throughout time. I think somebody said there's like 2,040 listed gods and religious systems throughout history. So that's a lot. So that means it's a popular concept. And if so, is religion sort of a focus and a cultural, vessel into which this common experience is sort of poured and then articulated with whatever sort of social and cultural norms and forces and powers that go along with that. So, you could think of this as so hunger is a human, basic human drive. It would be hard to imagine what being a human would be like if you never had hunger, right? Like this is just you want to eat, you want to survive, you want to grow. So if this is the case, then you could look at religion as like an expression of like the food cultures that develop. So humans are hungry all over the world, but what they eat, when they eat, how they eat, who they eat with, this is shaped by geographic forces and cultural norms and practices, right? It becomes very complicated. So we have lots of diverse food cultures in the world that are all expressions of and sort of complicated vessels for what is really just a profoundly fundamental human need, desire, sense to eat. That is probably seem very closely linked to survival, one would have to imagine. So is this where religion comes from? Now, this is generally not how religion is discussed. It's usually discussed as an external force, like there are gods in the world, there is a God, there are gods, there are religious institutions, all these things, quote unquote, exist out there. And therefore, what you're getting when you get religion is you're getting the accurate expression. And I think this is where the phenomenological approach is helpful, because sort of you could push the boundaries of phenomenology and say, even if God actually did exist, or the gods, take your pick, whatever you want, the great universal power, or Zoroaster, or but whatever your flavor of the day that you like, even if it were true, this is not what phenomenology wants to focus on. It wants to focus on, okay, what is the experience that comes from how, if there is a God and that God interacts with you, then what is your sense and response? This actually doesn't have that much to do with God. And in fact, there's this constant, there's this notion that its spiritual experiences are ineffable, which means they can't be expressed. But people won't effing stop talking about them, so they must be at least slightly effable, I would say, because people do go on, and there's whole libraries full of this sort of literature and material. But they say if God is a universal, let's say just take the classic sort of Western God as being an all-powerful, all-knowing, infinite in every direction, right? So even if that were true, phenomenology is useful here. And I think you kind of get the power of phenomenology as an approach, because it's like, what doesn't matter, because the human sensibility, mental capacity, this is all like does not allow you to experience that, even if it did exist, which it may or may not. But phenomenology doesn't have to argue that, doesn't care about that, because it's like, look, that could be all true, and yet you're still a finite mind with very limited capacities, and so you're never going to experience that. You're going to have something else. And so when people talk about the spiritual, one of the things that's interesting to me is they often will say like, oh, well, I have this sense of this greater power, or being connected to a greater whole, or being part of something. I think it's William James who talked about an oceanic feeling, right? Like that you either become bigger than you were and involved in the universe, and sort of you have this melting, or you encounter a force that is outside of you and is bigger and greater than anything you can imagine. And again, it's not to say that this is inaccurate, right? That people did not have this experience. What it is, the question is, what would this mean? How do we interpret this? How do we respond to it, assuming that people are doing the best they can to record it accurately? So one of the questions, again, that's raised is, you have an experience. How much of that experience, as you try to interpret it, is being shaped by, so for instance, like the religion or the spiritual practices of your society? So does, if you don't believe, or you've never been exposed to Christianity, does Jesus come to you in a dream? Notice it wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't know who the person was unless they had like a t-shirt on that said, hi, or a little name tag, hi, I'm Jesus, right? So clearly there's some shaping that goes on with your culture to those experiences. For instance, you're in the language of nothing else, again, which got me pondering all this. In any case, you're submerged in the culture and the language that culture uses to express anything. And so you're sort of fishing around within a preset field of possibilities. And if you've never been exposed to, the Greek myths where the chances Zeus comes down, or Hera, if you're a Christian, do you get visited by Ganesh? Like it's always that curious question to me. No, clearly what happens is it's something that has to be sensible to you, or it would truly be ineffable, right? Jesus might visit you, but if you have no experience of Christianity, this is truly ineffable, because you have I was visited by something for which I have no conception. And so I cannot talk about that. So what I'll do, I'll translate that into whatever it is. Words I do have available from my culture that do make me think, I can sort of interpret it this way. So that the shaping power and how much of these experiences are driven from external social and cultural forms being submerged internally and then being dealt with. This is one of those big questions that obviously I'm going to have no answers, by the way. This is, once again, I apologize. I'm not an answer person. There's just a lot of questions. So you can write these questions down. Feel free to answer them. That would be great, because then you would be famous. It'd be great philosophy. So these sorts of questions are important to think about, as how our cultures, in fact, will shape, influence, and to what extent do they drive them. A famous work in this field, or in this area, was written, a little over 100 years ago, give or take, right about that, by William James, as I just mentioned. And he called it The Varieties of Religious Experience. And you can even think of this as an early work, a bit of phenomenology and sort of cultural comparative exploration, because he did say, hey, what is it that people are experiencing? They reported a lot. What is it? Can we catalog it? It's sort of a organization, right? He's just trying to create a big sorting mechanism to understand the varieties of religious experience, and kind of make the equivalent of a biological, classes or phyla or species out of this. And he's a trained biologist and a trained medical doctor. And so this was very natural for him to say, hey, can we take these experiences, make big categories of them, and show that people all over the world in all kinds of different times are just having a very small subset of experiences. And one question to ask again, or another question to ask is, are all of these experiences, is spiritual like a big bracket that holds all these different experiences, or are all these experiences really just facets of one experience that just get articulated in different ways? Again, because at some core, people are saying this is difficult to express. how it gets shaped or formed really matters. And James listed a whole series of them. I think just go over a few quick ones because I think these are the most common. I think the most interesting, at least to me. And one he just had a category that he called just basically mystical experiences, which is when you have this sense of, I don't know what would you, the transcendence or profound insight or clarity that so many religious figures, philosophical figures have reported over time. Like all of a sudden this moment occurred, everything seemed clear. I felt like I was unified with the world. And I got some sort of incredible insight because I have some direct experience with the truth of the universe, and it came to me. Mathematically, this is mathematics created or discovered? And many mathematics report that they have this sense of sudden insight or breakthrough where they feel that they're not creating the mathematics, but finding it external to them. So this would make it almost a mystical experience. I wouldn't say almost, let's be clear. It would just be a mystical experience at this point if they're just having these transcendent moments where they're discovering external to them in the universe preformed truths that they're then importing back into the language of mathematics. Now, we don't generally talk about mathematics as a mystical experience, but this is what mathematicians talk about, which is an interesting distinction, right? We want to pretend like mathematics is this very clear, rigid science that's totally reasonable and rational, except for when you talk to mathematicians or you read biographies of mathematicians, this is not necessarily what they report in their experience, their phenomenological experience again. So this sense of transcendence or insight or clarity that generally is reported as being put you in touch with a greater reality again. So again, this is that notion of, there's something beyond me or outside of me or that I can yet interact with and sort of merge with. That sensibility is one that James explores under the category of sort of mystical experiences. Then you have the kind of road to Damascus experience, which is the conversion, which I think is, to me, perhaps the most interesting because it is this notion of how do we change or transform our beliefs, right? How do we go from having one set of values or convictions, and then what leads us to convert or change or transform in a dramatic shift? Now, what's curious here is this is often, like I said, a sudden, it can be slow, but generally it's reported that at some point, it all became clear and my whole life changed. Like I was transformed in that moment. Now, it might take time to ramify this and, put it into work or put it into action and so on. But this notion of going, what I thought was right was wrong, what I thought was wrong is right. Like these then again, there are these spiritual transformations. And once again, it's like, it's got to be this mix, right, of concepts from the outside that you've taken in, that you've been holding, that you've been exploring, that you've been thinking about. And then suddenly some event happens and that resonates in some way. And so people go, I encountered something that made me change, or I had an experience. So what is the nature of those experiences and how do they function and how do they work? And I think this is not unrelated to the conversion experience, is, in fact, I'm not even sure there are two categories. You can read James. I don't know, it's probably not an important exploration, but to me, I'm curious about these things, is the divided self to the unified self. And so division seems to be viewed as being bad, usually, right? Like this is like schizophrenia is cut against yourself, divided against yourself. Or, you're at war with yourself or you're in conflict with yourself. And I see why this is, you can see that this can be destructive, but I'm always curious about how much, I'm also worried about being too certain, like too much unification always has that sort of personal totalitarian feel about it, right? When does personal unification become self-delusion and totalitarianism, just personal totalitarianism? That's always a concern about that. But in any case, there's this constant, or not constant's the wrong word, consistent report of, oh, I was torn, I was divided, I didn't know what to do, I didn't know what was right, I didn't know what was wrong. And then all of a sudden I had this experience, right? I encountered a vision, I encountered a sense of unification and inner peace. I brought all of those conflicting emotions and disharmony, and I was able to create a sense of wholeness and harmony and true being more authentic or more whole. Indeed, if you think of Buddhism, this seems to be like one of the very central tenets of Buddhism, is that by the four truths and the eightfold path, you can get rid of this sense of being divided, get rid of the sense of being at war with yourself, and achieve the sense of harmony and unity. And they always saw that the leaf on the cool water, right? You can be that sort of, have that wholeness and that harmony, that integrity that people seem to long for. But one of the questions phenomenology would ask is, where does that longing for integrity come from, right? How is that shaped? How is that formed? And should we be suspicious of it? But as philosophy, I think you should be universally suspicious of it. But these kinds of questions come up, and so those three categories. He has more. Like I said, he has something on saintliness and trying to remember the others. There's ecstasies. Maybe he has a big section on religious sort of possession almost, right? Like when people are speaking in tongues, or you had the Elysian mysteries back from the ancient Greeks, or various kinds of possession ceremonies all over Africa where spirits come and inhabit people, which I do also think is interesting, because this is the notion that an external force, an external power, an external being in some cases takes you over. Right, so you become a different being. You become a person you were not. You become something other, and then for a time, you have different drives, different motives, different experience, You're different everything, because you're not yourself. You're just a puppet, or a vehicle, or again a vessel holding another set of experiences and ideas and values, which I think is a curious one. So he also talks about that. But of all these experiences, again, that's just a few of the ones that he talks about, but you can see there is this quite a range. And one question to ask of the many, again, is, are these just aspects of the same, right? Could we pull those all down and say, oh, this is just hunger? Or if we look at them, could we say, like, yeah, religious ecstasy is really something different, right? We can call it all spiritual. We can put it in a big category, but it's really a very different sensibility. In fact, if you think of the notion of unity, this says, oh, I'm one with the universe. If you think of possession, or, being of speaking in tongues, is like, oh, you're actually two. Right, because it's you and the being or the power that inhabits you. So it's actually a division, right? So it would be odd to articulate these as expressions of the same sort of thing. And so maybe there's a distinct drives in the human. One is to have a sense of unity, to have a sense of overcoming. Maybe this is a fundamental emotional or psychological need, to have some sort of sense of totality and unity. Also, there may be the sense of a desire or a strong to be inhabited, right? To be done with the self, to have the self go away for a while. And of course, if you think of the many drugs that people take and drinking and all kinds of experiences that people do, and they often say, oh, I just want to be out of my mind. I just want to be away from. Maybe this is a real base human need, is to just not be ourselves, right? Like, I think we've all had this experience. I certainly had, where you like just want to be, want it to all go away for a little bit. And maybe that is as real, and that we shouldn't say that these are all the same aspects. But again, this is where the phenomenological questions come in, which is to say, well, are we using these cultural values to take what is actually a disparate set of experiences and drives and desires and feelings and saying, oh, this is all one because they're kind of very different from the normal ones that we have, like, hunger and community and love and sex and sleep, and right, like we all these base drives that like a crocodile has maybe, but that we have these other ones, like, to be imaginative, to be creative, to be self-expressive, maybe to be bonded to a greater whole. One could even imagine that being community animals, being, tribal animals, that maybe there is a very base drive to be part of a greater whole, and that the power of some of these spiritual experiences is that at moments we feel, maybe that is the sense of culmination of that. Like, oh, it feels so powerful and so good because for whatever reason, all the external and internal forces have aligned, and all of a sudden we go, oh, I feel like I really am a member of the larger collective, however articulated. And so part of me, some really basic part that says, hey, you're a monkey in a tribe, you need to be part of the tribe, make sure that's going, is like, oh my gosh, for just a few minutes, for just a few hours, I feel totally and completely fulfilled in that drive. And that could be a very different drive, or a very different sense from maybe, the sense of being possessed or being taken out of yourself. It's like, oh, no. Maybe it's the drive to independence, to separate yourself. It's like, oh, maybe that is the super expression of this. And so when we talk about what's below this attempt to express the spiritual experiences that people seem to have, it's worth taking a moment and going, oh, hey, how much of that experience can we articulate, and where that might have been coming from? Is it a drive towards unity? Is it a drive towards peace? Like, is it a drive towards, being out of yourself, or is it a drive towards being into yourself? Right? Like, so this is, sometimes people will say the same thing. I felt most more in myself and part of something else at the same time, right? And so trying to disambiguate this. And again, then trying to disambiguate it from the greater cultural forces that drive us towards these sorts of thoughts that are shaping our experience, that may be primarily internal, but often driven, of course, by external forces that are associated with them. And so we have this sensibility. I think, people say, oh, it's music in particular, I always find is a very powerful. It gives you that, the power of music is often, it's so great because it's pre-linguistic, right? You don't need to have language. When you do have language, like lyrics, are hilariously, A, you can't understand them because the music and how they're being sung, and B, they tend to be senseless or nonsensical often. It's not to rubbish there are no good lyrics, because there are all kind of great poetic lyrics as well, but a lot of music does not live or die by the language. Maybe the sound of the language, yes, but not by the content of the words. But there's a whole lot of music that has no words associated with it. It is simply just sound and rhythm and harmony and development, and all of those forces are just, incredibly powerful because they're pre-linguistic, or right, like your language doesn't help you process. You feel it without having language interfere so much. It's just a very direct connection. And so people often talk about music as having this spiritual element, particularly some music as being peculiarly spiritual in nature. This is, North Indian classical music is often referred to in this way. It takes this very seriously. It thinks of itself as being very spiritual music, but also much classical music. There's bands like U2. I guess their concerts, people talk about them as saying, oh my gosh, like it's just this sort of amazing spiritual experience to go to a U2 concert. And there's other bands and musical varieties, genres that have the same impact, even though if you just look at it at a level of music, wildly different. Like these are wildly different styles. Debussy is not like U2, is not like Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, right? You would think these would be very different Venn diagrams, but people do talk about them as being these remarkably powerful, moving, and often sort of spiritual or religious experiences that they have when you encounter that and listen to it. And so again, it just raises this question. It's like, what is music communicating? How is it communicating? What are we taking in that makes so many people so consistently go, wow, that really was quote unquote spiritual? And that's, again, what phenomenology is trying to work out. Now, I've read a fair bit of the studies of phenomenology on religion, of which there's of course, there's a huge amount, but there's a fair amount of contemporary work being done on this. As far as I can tell, no one's making any headway. I mean, they make lots of interesting observations and they raise some interesting points. But I'm like, how do you cut through this thicket? I'm just not sure, because you're running into a series of already problematic things, which is like, how much is internal? How much is external, right? Does the external world exist? How do we know things? That's the whole field of epistemology, ontology. How do we get our sense of being? I mean, on one hand, I'm not a huge fan of Heidegger, but, full marks for raising very important questions and exploring them in interesting ways. But, so there's that. And then you have the whole swamp of language, which is kind of how I got started on this. So we may as well just exit on that. So when you try and think about anything in particular, but I like spiritual seems to be sort of just at the edge of what we try to do with language, right? How do we get a grip on it? How do we feel it? How do we get a sense of it? Just at that very limit of what we can express, you realize like how problematic language is. Because like, oh yeah, I know these words aren't capturing it. It's not, it's beyond this. It's ineffable. And yet we have that desire to communicate. And because people seem to take it in, it kind of seems like we're communicating something, What's curious to me though, and a thought I would like to leave you with is it the case that spiritual is just so remote and so difficult and so personal that it's troubling to try to communicate it? Or are we just deceived by the seeming facility with which we can communicate more quote-unquote concrete experiences? Like, oh, that's a car. This is, I was tired, right? We use these words and we go, oh, the person clearly knows what I mean, and I clearly know what they mean when they express these words. And so language seems to have a much greater facility when we're doing, when we're more mundane or more concrete or more obvious. Or is it simply that our cultural shaping has been more effective and efficient, and we just are seeming to communicate more effectively and more personally and more directly than we really are? This is where I'm always come back to. I'm like, how much are we really, how much are we getting across? Is the concepts around spirituality an outlier, or are they really representative of the struggles that we have? And the great thing about reading phenomenology is, again, I don't know, never know what conclusions phenomenology derives, but I can tell you one thing it does is it knocks a lot of pins out of your certainty. When you start really thinking about how we experience things like time and sensation and memory and place and space, wow. It really quickly you're like, but how do we even cross the road, right? How do I ever make it to the coffee shop to buy coffee? Because we're clearly operating on such a constrained set of sense parameters, overwritten with emotion and cultural training, all interpreted through this crazy sieve of language, an attempt to use reason and logic and appeal to earlier experiences that are often misremembered, and we project into the future, of which we are terrible, right? Like you kind of add that all up when you do the phenomenological readings, and you go, wow, it's like kind of amazing. And yet we do. And yet we do. And yet, if you read texts, Buddhism has been resonant for a long time. The mystical texts from many cultures are resonant for thousands of years. And it suggests, maybe that's the strongest word you can use in the term of phenomenological research, it suggests that there really seems to be something there. I mean, all these religions exist for a reason. So either there's a whole bunch of gods that are traipsing around and doing stuff and really just trying to confuse us and doing a pretty damn good job of that. Or, which I think is probably more likely, is these narratives, these stories, these cultural forms really do speak to some internal need, some internal drive, some internal experiences that are shared across most humanity as we try to struggle to understand ourselves and where we are in the world and how we fit in, and what is it, these feelings that we have occasionally, not always, but occasionally, that overwhelm us or inspire us or terrify us or transform us. How do we process those? How do we come to terms with them? How do we understand them? And that's what was kind of the questions and central to my mind as I thought, what is it? What is the phenomenology of spirituality? So, a probably unhelpful, but hopefully interesting and entertaining reflection on the question of spirituality within a phenomenological context. Thank you very much.